I'm presenting to you today a insight into a ongoing project, a derivative of the Robots for Last Days project, spearheaded by myself together with Tero Carpi, Yvette Granata, Johannes Deich, and Derek Curry at the University of Buffalo in the Department of Media Study. And so what the Robots for Last Days project attempts to do is to map out this condition of robots and human beings at the end, as it were. So robots and human death, and that is voluntary death and involuntary death. And the involuntary death aspect is what Tero has been working on with killer robots, and this presentation goes more towards the voluntary component in the sense of if we were to give ourselves over to robots in the end. And so what does that mean? That is robot healthcare. What does that look like? And so one of the problems is that we ask ourselves, well, how would we even start to address this problem? And so the approach that we've taken is, well, let's look at some case studies. And we're currently in the process of writing a paper on this topic, and the approach has been to look at actually 3 particular robot care systems and to ask ourselves what kind of a robot actions are being created with these systems, and how do they work together with people. And so one of the most notorious and famous robot care systems out there currently is the Paro robot. And so, how would you study the Paro robot? And so if you just look at the Paro robot, you see, as the image on the right, that it looks very much like a baby seal. And so the argument that I'm going to make today is that as long as we look at robots as visual creatures, we will not be able to understand them, criticize them, nor come up with proper ways how to understand them. So the argument is that the robot Paro in the middle is much closer to the industrial robot you have on the left-hand side, and that this connection to the right-hand side, this visual, is, as we see, kind of like a ploy, or the interaction face, or the skin, or what. And currently there's a lot of discussion of how robots are with human beings on that level, but not on the other level. And that's where this contribution is intended to land. So how would you then go about starting to read a robot under this new regime? So here's the motivation from a different angle. Robots carry actually robot history in them, the history of industrialization, and they tell a story. By observing this story and the inner workings of the robots in their control systems, one can uncover not only details of this robot history, but seeds of future narratives. The control systems and the architectures devised for precise motions and reliable actions are not just applied to healthcare, they define how care is executed and experienced by human beings. Robots alter healthcare and redefine not only the dependencies between machines and people, but also the basic concepts of care. So if you take industrial processes and apply them to a new field, they carry their limitations and opportunities with them. Furthermore, robots and humans are embodied with physical presence in the world. The control architecture perspective, and that's the one I'm advocating for here, allows us to read a robot as a design by which to interact with the world. Hold on a second here. And this reading will tell us not only how the robot designers solve difficult technical problems, but how they choose to respond to the features of the world and how they choose to craft the response of the robot. Reading robots includes reading visual appearances, but sets that which is visible in relation to the cognitive and mechanical affordances of the robot. A robot control architecture inclusive reading of a robot should allow us to see not only what the robot can do, but what its limitations are and how the system manages those limitations. Through observation of control affordances within a robot system, we can construct a more robust bridge to a critical position on the actual making of relationships between people and robots. So let me now do a robot reading for you on the Paro robot. And so if you have a Paro robot, maybe you've seen them online, they're cutesy little dolls, and they squeak and they move and they seem to respond to you. And when you have that response, specifically elderly people are very taken in by the robot, and studies have shown that they actually even, the Paros are so powerful that it changes the physiology of elderly people. In other words, you can measure changes in their urine. I mean, it's amazing. So how does Paro do that? And so the thing is, when you experience Paro, you experience a lumped series of events. And the architecture on the right allows us to read these disparate components and see how they're put together. And the basic idea between Paro is that there's two threads here. You have proactive processes and reactive processes. The reactive processes are the kind of things that happen when you actively engage the robot and it responds. So for example, if you stroke it, it might make a sound. If you stroke it on one side of its body, it might move to that side. You stroke it on the other side, it will do something else. And this reaction to an input is an immediate sign of being alive. This has been tested and tried in robot and animatronics for a long time, and then people know how to do that. But in order to make something that seems not just reactive, but also has a life of its own, you have to add other things. And so what Paro does very cleverly is have another layer in this architecture called the proactive processes. And these are things that are internal to the system outside of action by other people, by human beings. So for example, Paro responds to light conditions. Paro has a clock that is not just in the sense of mechanical clock keeping time, but basically a diurnal state. So it is a creature that is dependent on day and night. And this dependency on day and night, which is very easy to do technically, but coupled with the reactive processes, means that that artificial creature behaves much more like the creature with which it is intended to interact with. So in other words, for an elderly person, when Paro has to go to sleep at 8 o'clock and is no longer available for playing, that fact, even though it's asleep, is an entry point to a connection to the robot that is similar to an infant or a baby what that also needs its own off time. And so what we can do when we read this architecture is take these parts apart. And that is one contribution of this robot reading that I'm advocating for here. Okay, next. So much for the Paro robot. Another class of robots that are under investigation are, for example, robot systems intended for people with mental disabilities or end-of-life mental conditions such as dementia. And what's currently happening is that these kind of care systems are being developed on two threads, one kind of like from the ground up, and another one as offshoots from other projects. And one of these other projects is what I'm showing you here. This is from the Arkin lab at Georgia Tech, where the group has been developing control architectures for autonomous drones. And specifically, I mean, there are control architectures for these drones already, but what this group has been working on for several years now is to endow these robots with an ethical framework, and in particular, an ethical governor. So let me show you this control architecture for ethical robots that is currently being investigated for drone warfare. And so it has two parts that are of interest for us here. And one is the overall organization, that we see that from the get-go, you have kind of like a framework of constraints that interacts with, for example, mission planning, reasoning components. You have adaptive elements where ethical rules come in. Constraints are configured as a central node. There's a location for a robot-human interface. In other words, there's a human operator who can intervene into the system. And then here at the bottom left, behavior patterns that are then summed up in a particular fashion. We'll get to that in a moment. And then in the end, a behavior is made. In other words, a command is made to drop a bomb or not. And then there's a component in there called the ethical governor. And that's sort of the novel component of this contribution. The ethical governor is a is a software component that allows the robot to question that final decision. So even after all these calculations and deliberations have been done, there's a component where the robot could say, is this actually what should happen? And so there's two ways how that governor acts. One is the robot asks that question, and the other is that the operator actually asks that question. So the operator with the joystick can say, wait, I think something might have gotten wrong or something changed. Let me abort mission. And that's an interesting, let's say, improvement to the current situation if you're interested in these killer robots. But for my presentation, I'm interested in actually something else, because it turns out that precisely this architecture is being proposed for a robot that is supposed to show empathy for Parkinson's patients, precisely the same robot with one addition. And I'll get to that addition in a moment. So what we see here, if we read robots through control architecture, we see similarities that you would otherwise not see. And here it's blatantly obvious. Basically, it's the same architecture. So what are we inheriting? Right? One-to-one, the limitations, the constraints, the way of thinking moves over from a robot for warfare to a robot for healthcare. And so we can see this live here now. But let's get back to this addition that the researchers are proposing to make this an actual empathy-enabled robot. And so here's this component, and excuse the mathematics here. I just want to go into this a little bit because this is another level of the reading of robot architecture that I think also needs attention, and people don't do it so much. So let me just go here a little bit. So the model assigns, this is from the paper on the Parkinson robot, a probability for feeling an emotion. And so here, and then they describe exactly how they do that. And it turns out they use a logic function and any number of components here, component K, emotion threshold, weight of component, how do you ascribe those weights? It's not described. But the point is that two things are going on here. On the one hand, you have a numerical mathematical formulation of something from another field. And robotics does this all the time because they have to. Their concern is, how do I make it work in the robot, independent of what it is? And then kind of like as a second order, well, are we doing justice to this problem, which is feeling an emotion? And so if you go over actually to the literature of people who are dealing with feeling an emotion, or what they say in the technical term, emotional empathy, you'll see that this problem is highly debated in the sense of like, how would you actually do that? And it's debated on two levels. So here we go, kind of like a 10-year-old problem statement and a rather current one. So already 204, it was clear, which we know as, regular people, we know empathy is motivated behavior and does not so often get automatically triggered. Most of the time, this behavior is regulated top-down, processing involving cultural values, concepts, and the like. And then the example here, although a large number of people were apparently devastated by the Challenger disaster and expressed a lot of sympathy, it seems fewer people have expressed concern for the 800,000 individuals slaughtered in the Rwanda genocide. So what we know is that things that are close to you generate more empathy than things that are farther away. The role of the other matters. And here, fast forward 10 or 9 years, another mathematical formulation of an empathy model, and this is for an artificial agent, so it's a little bit different. But what's important here is that you see that even on the mathematical level, there are two entities required to generate empathy. So there's the person who experiences it, and there's the thing that is seen. And so what's fascinating about the Arkin architecture solution is that they've taken out the other. There is no other. And so this abstraction of the other changes the way one can even think about empathy, let alone calculate it. And so how would we know this if we didn't go into these details? Because it's, like, how do you surface a fundamental problem? You can start from the top or you can go from the bottom. And what I'm arguing for here is a robot reading from the bottom up allows one to make more concise statements about what's happening in the fundamental level. So, and then another robot project, and here I want to step aside from the technical details and bring a different kind of critique on here. So this is the Aspire project that is currently being built up. It's just been awarded a grant. And the idea here is that these mini robots will be able to somehow deliver healthcare to patients in a room. So they're going to fly around and bring pills or glasses of water or whatever a patient needs. So this is very curious kind of like imagination that the thing a person needs most when they're ill would be flying drones zapping around. And it's augmented by drones on the ground. So you're like, I mean, you're in a cloud of robots whizzing around. And well, okay, the idea here is that some people will need that. So regardless of how we might feel about this, what's interesting is that the rationale for performing this investigation lies actually in prior research of this PI in robust control systems for flying drones. And what they demonstrated was that they can control drones, so multiple drones in the air, they can create formations, land in a particular place, take off again, do all kinds of fancy things. In other words, they've been able to solve an applied control problem very sophisticated manner, very robustly. And so because they can do that, the idea is, well, why not just pick another application? And so healthcare is basically for robotics just an application, which is probably not the best way to look at it. But another level, like the reason that we're not having a discussion about this is because, so for example, the way the actions of the robots are described by the PI for the common presser, what she calls them Cinderella Box, and gives a cutesy name to it. And so here these ideas that you have these fantastical creatures that come and do wonderful things for you, and well, it's just magic. And so the problem is with that approach is that by infantilizing the robots and dumbing the recipients of robot care down, we are actually out of the loop, out of the critical loop. We can't even question the very complicated and sophisticated machines that are being built for us. And so, this is not necessarily an outcome of the robot reading, but it's another aspect of looking for differences between how a robot appears and how a robot is acting. Right? And this is kind of like a difference operator. We might interpret that as a form of cultural critique. It might be a new way of trying to get to make the robot discussion a bit more sophisticated, maybe, because it is happening, and it is really time to think about that in a serious way.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm almost done. Is that okay?
Yeah, cool.
Okay, one more. So the value of reading robots through their architectures is that it removes some rhetoric turns from the robot narrative. Looking inside robots gives us a better idea of what they do and what they cannot do. The more robots expand into delicate territory, such as healthcare, the clearer we should be on just what those differences are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.